Is the zero waste movement dying? A lot of people have been asking this really great question about the rise of imperfect environmentalism, and I think this is something that should be talked about. Before we get started, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because it really helps support my channel, and producing these videos does take a lot of time and labor for my team, so I just really appreciate any subscribe, like, or comment. Thank you so much. There was a recent post that I found almost a few months ago from one of my great creators that is named Tara. I'm going to showcase the screenshot below. The screenshot kind of talked about the rise of popularity of zero waste and if it was dying. She referenced a Google search and saying that the searches for zero waste was actually decreasing, and this was actually almost a year ago, so in 2022. Now I'm not too sure about 2023, but here is an updated stat on that. Basically what she was saying is that there is this need for people to kind of understand that zero waste is not really an accessible term. In previous videos we talked about, is the zero waste movement racist? I like to think that zero waste itself, like the terminology originally for what it was defined, was for corporations and institutions to redesign circular and build circular systems that were actually sustainable and that did not negatively discharge on communities of color and non-human animals. But I think that was really hijacked by this individualistic lifestyle because a lot of the zero waste influencers during the early 2010s were typically white women. And not to say that those people are the issue, I just like to say that media does a really good job in centering whiteness. And so when we're not talking about zero waste from a Black, Indigenous people of color perspective, we are erasing ancestral history. A lot of sustainability influencers are now embracing what you would call imperfect environmentalism, and I'm not trying to say that, it's a bad thing that they're doing that. I'm just saying the fact that it is interesting to see that a lot of the influencers that would promote a low waste or zero waste lifestyle that would kind of uphold the same systems of whiteness are now contributing to this idea of like, well, you can be imperfect, it's okay to be messy, use plastic, it's the only way, there's no such thing as zero waste. And I'm not trying to say that it's a horrible thing that they're doing this now. I just think that there's a lot of hypocrisy that exists in those messaging. It's like, if you were going to actually talk about zero waste, then you should acknowledge that you upheld this individualistic, sometimes perfectionist, that is rooted in white supremacy lifestyle, but you're never probably going to hear about that. What I think that the zero waste movement, why it's died down, is the fact that a lot of general consumers do not understand what it means. And I think it's a good thing that zero waste itself is losing popularity, because I often think that this minimalistic lifestyle with trash jars or with even like, your metal straw or just your cotton tote bag, it's just unrealistic. Like, if you look at like Black, brown people of color who grew up in poverty, like, it's repackaged poverty lifestyle. And I'm not here to say that those individuals are bad people either. I'm just saying that, there's not really an acknowledgement that a lot of people who are in poverty are living that way already. It just may not look the same. Like, maybe someone, instead of a cotton tote bag, they upcycled their old t-shirt and use that as, an upcycled thing. Or someone puts, the mantequilla or the butter, whatever jar or whatever you call it, the container, and they use it for salsa. Like, that's that itself is not seen as aesthetic, it's not seen as pretty. And so I think this glorification of aesthetics does come from this idea of this clean, minimalistic lifestyle, but that doesn't really attune and I don't think relates to a lot of consumers. And so when people are asking me like, why don't you talk more about zero waste, it's not the fact that I reclaim the word, it's just the fact that I don't really see the significance of zero waste anymore in my own work, because I think that so many people have been consumed and generalized that zero waste means this plastic-free lifestyle, and I feel like it has a negative connotation now. And I think, yes, people should reclaim the word if they want to, but I think in my line of work, I don't really say it anymore because I don't see the need to say it, and nor do I think that zero waste is irrelevant when it comes to that dominant lifestyle. But I think when it comes from the systemic circular system, I think it should continue being used in these policy discussions, because that does matter when influencing corporations. But the zero waste movement, I think, one of my biggest critiques is like, what systemic action have they brought to the table? And I think They haven't. I don't think the zero waste lifestyle movement really brought systemic lifestyle change. Instead, it brought general individual lifestyle change, which I think that's great, but then it became this weird personification of individualism and also shaming people for using plastic or not understanding the intersections about people who are disabled and have to use plastic, or understanding the fact that yes, we live in a plastic consumer society. And I remember I made this analogy about people who are very plastic free and versus the vegans. I often felt like even if I was vegan and I was using plastic, I remember once being shamed by an environmentalist that was plastic free. They weren't vegan, but it was a really interesting conversation I had with them because they were saying, why are you using plastic? And I agree, maybe I shouldn't have had to use plastic, but at the same time, I just use plastic because we were in a pandemic and I just said maybe this is safer for me to use. And yeah, shame on me for not addressing it, but I also felt like, you know, it's almost this like very totalitarian or this very hyper focused individualism to shame one another of not being good enough to use it. And that's where I think zero waste really messed up, is that it ended up becoming a movement rooted in interrogation than education. And I'm not saying either that the influencers that I follow that are really great friends of mine are the issue. I just think that there should have been more acknowledgement and education and understanding that, you know, if you're going to be talking about sustainable lifestyles, if you're going to talk about imperfect environmentalism, you need to talk about how Black, Indigenous people of color are at the forefront of these lifestyles, because we are the ones who are deprived systemically from the most resources. We are the ones who have been creating these types of systems, whether through our clothing, our food, our architecture, our stories, the way that we speak, our dialect. Like, these are all ways in which we practice and embody zero waste. And I think that, you know, this is why we see the hijacking of movements, is that white people, you know, steal things from cultural communities and then repackage it and say it's theirs. It's like, it was never yours, nor do we say it's ours. I think it's more about how we live with the embodiment of Earth. Imperfect environmentalism has entered a lot of conversations in the last few years, and I think it became popular around a year or 2 years ago when people started to recognize that, hey, you know, using plastic is okay in terms of like, it's really impossible to be plastic free. And I really think that, you know, this came about when I think realizing that there's been a cultural shift in general, young consumers, is that everyone knows that like nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to be having this perfect lifestyle. And so a lot of sustainability and UGC creators, I feel like they're so owned in on the idea of imperfect environmentalism. You know, I think there's this acknowledgement of like, oh shoot, I was upholding this system, so let me do better. And I think that's good, but also there's no acknowledgement that we have been trying to talk about imperfect environmentalism. We have been saying that, you know, Black, Indigenous people of color have lived in this society that has deprived us from resources, and that's what's the issue. And I think sustainability itself has become such a huge marker of indication for brands. Like, if you look the term sustainability, it's used everywhere, like entertainment, theater, food, technology, education. Like, sustainability is now a generally accepted term. And I think corporations understand that if you had a choice to choose between sustainability, zero waste, you would choose sustainability, because sustainability makes more sense. Zero waste kind of has this negative connotation of like, I don't know if we want to say zero waste because we have some type of packaging or we have some type of resource. And so that's why sustainability is being used more. And I'm not trying to say either, like, I'm going to call myself out here personally. It's like, I have sustainability on my Instagram profile bio because I know that brands see it. And yes, I may be in the sustainability movement. Yes, I have a knowledge and experience learning about sustainability when I worked at companies and majored in environmental science. But at the end of the day, I realized too, like, you know, sustainability is this more general consensus term of like, you're just an earth-friendly lifestyle and it's undefined. Because at the end of the day, sustainability is still not clearly defined. If you want to argue that from a corporate standpoint and an individual standpoint, like, what does sustainability mean? And I've defined sustainability as a circular relationship to create a harmonious world with humans and non-human animals that does not negatively discharge on the environment. And so sustainable lifestyles come from this indigenous lifestyles and wisdoms that have been existent in our society today. So my critique about zero waste is that zero waste was never defined in the lifestyle movement, right? When you look at Bea Johnson, who is known as quote unquote the mother of the zero waste, which I kind of have problems with the terminology like that, because yes, she may have been one of the first big ones in the lifestyle movement, but she's not the mother. Like, indigenous people are the mother of zero waste movements. They embody it. And so I don't really know what ended up happening to her. But look, this is the issue when you center white women, is that a lot of people got disorders from trying to live a plastic-free lifestyle. Like, I knew when I started to reduce my waste as an individual is that I knew that the easiest thing that I can do is just say no to free things. Like, that to me is more obtainable for zero waste. But what ended up happening is that all these influencers that were rising about zero waste, they never clearly defined it, what that meant to them. And so I think one or a few people just said, like, it's the use of having no plastic waste. And so literally people took it to that extreme and literally mentally tortured themselves. It's kind of like if you look back at like raw veganism. In the early days of raw veganism, there was this YouTuber, and I don't even remember her name, but she talked about changing her eye color and how she went raw vegan and all this stuff. And literally, and then there's this other woman that ate bananas or whatever. And a lot of people got eating disorders from that. It was just like, it's so ridiculous to see the fact that so many young people are influenced by this and they consume this culture. And I almost consumed it at one point too when I was younger. And luckily I didn't. But you know, it's this like mental damage that so many young people get, and there's no acknowledgement of that. I was like, well, it's not my fault. I try to be imperfect as much. It's like, no, you did never really spoke about it clearly. You never said that it should never go to the point where it hurts your mental and physical health. Instead, we just said this is the standard, this is the label that we need to achieve to have a plastic-free lifestyle, and that's what people did. And so like the conversations around Plastic-Free July, I also feel like as an organization, they're really great. I think they do really good awareness about public education, but I also think like, I don't know, like the idea of people reducing their plastic waste is great, but plastic-free living itself is just unobtainable when you are poor and you don't have resources. We need to acknowledge always that plastic-free living is a privilege. Like, who has time to go to farmer's market? Who has time to buy these zero waste products? Who has time to constantly think about not reducing waste? Poor people are always criminalized for not living a sustainable lifestyle, and I think it needs to be important that sustainable lifestyles have always been practiced from people who are poor and in poverty. And as someone that lives in the global north, I recognize that when I visited different countries in the global south, they actually rely on less plastic usage, and I've seen then that they're much more sustainable. And when people say like, oh, well, everyone can do it, I do think that is a bit of classist and also, ableist remark to say that. You know, I think if we're going to be very clear, I think we should say like, yeah, people with economic privilege should reduce their plastic waste. I don't think that's controversial to say that, but to the point to say, well, you can live completely plastic free, I think that's a supremacist type of the way of thinking. And this is where I feel like with my audience, I've always been true to saying that, like, yes, embrace your flaws, yes, try your best to reduce your waste, but if you're not going to acknowledge that poor Black, Indigenous people of color have always been the most sustainable, then you are erasing a lot of the history that we've contributed to the zero waste movement. And when you think about zero waste, you think a lot about minimalists and white faces. You don't think about Black, Indigenous people of color. Why is it the fact that we cannot relate zero waste to a Black or brown person of color? Like, let's ask ourselves that. Do you know someone who practices zero waste that is Black, Indigenous person of color? Why is it the fact that the first things that come up in your head are typically white women? And that's the thing, even myself, where I had to really examine this unconscious bias of like, wow, the ways in which I've actually consumed media has not really centered diversity. It's not really centered people of color, and that is what needs to change. Anyways, the rise of zero waste movement dying, I think, is actually a good thing in my view. I think it needed to be staked as a death sentence because I think for what it served was really great in the early 2010s. And you know, I think in terms of like people being attracted to this plastic-free lifestyle was almost a trend. I mean, I don't really see that much conversations about plastic-free living. I think more about plant-based and veganism is more popular. That's more accessible and obtainable. So I do think that there's been this like really cultural shift that's been happening, which is really good. But I also think there needs to be this extension of power that is being brought to communities of like, look, we're not trying to say that you practicing zero waste is bad, but we're just trying to say that perhaps the ways that we practice zero waste is through how we move, how we dance, our clothing, the food. Like, it's not, I think we need to abandon the terminology itself in our lifestyles and just embodying those actions to say that we don't need to say we're zero waste because we already embody it. So my last thing about this is that imperfect environmentalism needs to address that Black and Indigenous people of color have always been at the forefront of these forms of environmentalism and sustainable lifestyles, and without it, you are erasing history. And I really hope that you all really have this critical conversation about what does zero waste mean to you, and do you think that the terminology zero waste actually makes sense to use? Let me know in the comments what you think about it, and I hope to hear from you all soon.